What is our relationship to the land, to its other than human inhabitants, and to the rest of humanity? These are fundamental questions for thinking through how we can transform ourselves in ways that allow a multiplicity of ecologies and human communities to thrive alongside one another. And these questions are not just fundamental to us as individuals, they're essential to how we view our cultures, traditions, institutions, and ways of knowing. Layel Camargo lives at the vibrant intersection of ecological justice, queer liberation, and indigenous culture. A cultural space that offers a distinctive vantage point on how our societies work, while holding enormous potential to both see and reorient our relationships to the land and to one another. And besides that, Layel is hilarious.
My passion for humor has been maintained by a lot of data and information that I've gotten around just the importance of people being able to process things through laughter, and that the climate crisis is nothing to make mockery and or to laugh. It's very serious, the ways in which our species is kind of being at threat of extinction and right before our eyes. But I think that as humans, we're so complex and layered, and we're so beautiful in the sense that we get to feel so intensely, and feeling is what motivates us to take action. And laughter helps you process so much data quicker. It helps you be able to take something in, embrace it, release, and then have it make an impression.
I'm John Fiege, and this is Chrysalis. Layel Camargo is an organizer and artist who advocates for the better health of the planet and its people by restoring land, healing communities, and promoting low-waste, low-impact lifestyles. Layel is a transgender and gender nonconforming person who is an indigenous descendant of the Yaqui and Mayo tribes of the Sonoran Desert. I met Layel at a climate storytelling retreat in New York City in 2019, where I became a huge fan of their work and their way of being in the world. Layel is founder of the Shelterwood Collective, a Black, Indigenous, and LGBTQ-led community forest and retreat center. Our conversation explores the idea of culture as strategy in confronting the climate crisis, diving into Layel's work in video, podcasting, and poetry, and the origins of their approach to this work of healing people and planet. Here is Layel Camargo. Can you start out by telling me where you grew up and how you viewed your relationship to the rest of nature when you were a kid?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Mexican border between Tijuana and San Diego, and my upbringing was in this very highly dense migrant community from Latinx to Philippines because of the proximity to the military base. It was a very militarized town. Pretty much the professions there are like you either work for Homeland Security, the military, or police. And I didn't really notice what my upbringing was like until I left. But I grew up crossing the border back and forth. My grandmother migrated from the Sonoran Desert to Tijuana. And that's basically where my mother was born. And she went to high school in San Diego, which is why I can say I'm an American citizen. But I'm a descendant of the Mayo or the Yoreme tribes on my grandmother's side, and then my grandfather's side, the Yaqui tribes of the Sonoran Desert. So I think for me, my connection ecologically was like the ocean, because I grew up in a beach city. And then it was also the desert because of all the stories and my grandmother's connection to Sonora. I never felt like I was at home, because as a queer person, I had never really fit into the conservative nature of San Diego due to how militarized it is and all this stuff. But it was through a drive, which I took from Northern California down to Sonora, where my grandmother's family lives. When I drove through the saguaros in Arizona, that I remember seeing this saguaro forest and just like needing to pull over and just like take them in. And I had this visceral feeling that I don't think I've ever had before of just like being home. And I think this experience was like in 2000, I want to say 2017. And that's when I realized that in theory, I was a climate activist. I cared about the planet, but it wasn't until that moment that I was like, oh, what I'm actually doing is like actually fighting for us to return to be in better relationship with the planet. And this is where I belong. This is my source of my root, these trees and this desert. So because of that, and growing up in proximity to the beach, water conservation has always been an area of like passion for me and caring about the ocean, which pushed me to a practice of lowering my plastic consumption and being more mindful of oil consumption. Um, and the desert has always been a source of like grounding in regards to like place and knowing that I come from the earth. So
Well, can you tell me more about the path you took from the neighborhood where you grew up in San Diego, um, to studying at UC Santa Cruz, and what that experience was like for you?
yeah, I went. So I grew up in a home where there was a lot of violence, which is very common in a lot of migrant, specific and indigenous communities, and I kind of came into my teenage years like really realizing that I was different, but I didn't know how. And it kind of got summarized in college around my queerness, my sexuality, and my gender. But just feeling this need of like needing to leave, it just didn't make sense for me to be there. And with that being said, I had a wonderful community. I still have quite a few friends in San Diego that I keep in touch with. My sisters live there, and I was actually just there last weekend. So when I was in San Diego, I think a lot of my trauma responses of like just ignore what doesn't make sense and just keep moving forward was how I kind of functioned in that
Right.
space. Um, and I loved it. I succeeded at it. I've actually realized that I'm a performance artist because of that upbringing. And so, like, was captain of the water polo team. I was president of my senior class. I was featured in newspapers for my swimming. I was a competitive swimmer for 10 years. I did a good job. I had advanced placement classes and honors classes, and I was well rounded, but in the inside, I just didn't feel like I belonged.
Right.
So I picked UC Santa Cruz to go to college because it was the farthest university in the University of California system that had accepted me. And I went. And I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I visited the campus like 2 to 3 weeks before I had to actually be there to live on campus. And when my dad drove me up with my whole family, drove me up, and they left me. They were like, "Are you sure you want to stay?" I'm like, "I got this." Like it was all redwoods. It was definitely like we went down to the local store, and it was like all of these like hippie dreadlock folks, and I was like, I don't even know what I got myself into, but I'm getting this degree, so we're good. um, and it was a big culture shock, I think, for a lot of Black and Brown and Indigenous youth when they have to leave their communities to attend what is like better economic opportunities outside of them. It's more than just having to adjust. It's having to really let go. I had to let go of everything I knew, and in order for me to take the most out of college. And I was fortunate enough that I had a container. A university is like a container for young folks that I
Mm,
wasn't having to leave for work or opportunities. And so I fully immersed myself, and it allowed me to be able to identify myself sexually and through my gender. And it gave me solace when, my family rejected me for coming out. And I think that I'm so fortunate that I had that experience. And then I was also able to gain a double bachelor's in feminist studies and legal studies, which allowed me to have some upward mobility that my family hadn't had traditionally.
mhm.
I'm the first person in my whole family to attend a 4 year university after high school. So
Wow.
I'm definitely very grateful that that path took me there. And at this point, I feel like it was not only good for me, but it was good for my whole family for me to have taken that journey.
And did you come out to them in college or before college?
In college, yeah, it was my second year. I had my first girlfriend,
Mm-hmm.
and I was a resident advisor. I'm always trying to be the overachiever. So I was like resident advisor of my college. I was like involved in every club. I was part of a dance team, and my mom called me. I just decided to actually move in with my girlfriend the following quarter. And she was like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm at my girlfriend's house." And she was like, "Why do you have to tell me those things?" And I'm just like, "Because I'm not going to lie to you." And she was like, "I know you're gay, but I just don't need you to rub it in my face." And I was like, "Then I guess we can't talk." And so we didn't talk for 3 months.
Oof.
And then she called me. It's hard, like going to college is hard, especially when I went to very marginalized public schools before that. So I was struggling academically.
Mm.
And my solace was like being involved on campus, like to meet some social needs. And I was in a retention program for Black and Brown youth from urban communities, so that helped a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But I my mom kind of rupturing that really, I didn't realize what the impact was until probably the quarter into after that. And she called me 3 months later and was like, "So are you not going to talk to me?" And I was like, "You're the one that doesn't talk to me." And she was like, "Well, let's just try to make this work."
Wow.
um, and so it took probably 5 to 6 years for my family to kind of fully integrate my lifestyle, as they call it.
The magic word.
The magic word, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's just what you need, right? In the middle of college, trying to adapt to, crazy new culture and world is for your family to
Hmm.
reject you.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things that like a lot of queer LGBTQ folks, I feel like it's so normalized to us.
Right.
And it's just like, well, when you come out, just expect to lose everything. And I
Right.
think it isn't now until I'm like in my 30s that I realize how painful that is, and how like it's just like one of the core things I think as a human species is to know that you belong somewhere. And if you don't belong at home, then where do you belong? And I think for many of us, we've had to go through that unconsciously without really thinking through that we're seeking to belong. And this theme of belonging has been something that's been coming up as I navigate like my professional career now, is that like I really do want people to feel like they belong somewhere. And the only thing I feel like makes sense is we all belong to the planet. We all belong to the same
Mm,
descendants and how we got here as a species. And that, I think that's being rejected from my family allowed me to be like, where do I belong? And so I'm
mm,
fortunate that I had a best friend who was also queer. I had my queer community. I had student governments and student social organizing. And then when I graduated, I was like, wait, like where else do I belong? So I went to my natural habitats, like to the beach, and I picked up surfing again and scuba diving. And then it was like, oh, I actually like I belong to the earth. Like that's where I belong.
that's beautiful. So before coming to climate justice work, you worked as an organizer with the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. Can you tell me how your work in transformative justice informed your understanding of the climate crisis and how you approach ecological concerns?
Yeah, so I organized with transformative justice for about 6 years. And then for folks who don't know, transformative justice is an alternative response model to violence, harm, and hurt. And so, similar to restorative justice, which works with the carceral systems, so police, judicial systems, etc., to reform in order to help alleviate some of the biases that exist in those systems. Transformative justice says those systems actually don't serve certain communities like migrants, folks like that are trans, just the way that those systems just inherently violate certain people who are not included in our society fairly, was like transformative justice exists to serve folks who cannot access or choose not to access or use the carceral system. So if you believe in defunding the police, and let's say you're sexually assaulted, you're probably not going to call the police for a rape kit, because there's probably ways that you've experienced those systems as harmful or violent. So when I started organizing with Transformative Justice, this spoke to me as somebody who had just come out as trans, somebody who grew up in a mixed status family. I have relatives who have been deported. And I realized, like, oh, it's actually worth investing in alternative models besides the police, in order for us to get our needs met when crises do happen, because they happen to all of us. And I was in it for 6 years. I had built up a great capacity to work with people who had caused harm, people who had caused domestic violence, sexual assault, and transforming their behavior and working towards reparation of relationships, and or just like helping victims be able to move on after something like that happens. And it wasn't an easy task. And what we would come back to is we would spend like the first front of the months trying to make sure that people's basic needs were met in order for them to slow down enough to process what had just happened. And basic needs included food, included shelter. If they lived near a toxic site, what was infringing on their health, making sure that they had access to health coverage or health benefits. And that was about like 60% of what we were doing, was making sure that we could get the basics kind of stable so that they could jump into really honoring what it was that justice looked like for them. And in doing this a handful of times, not too many, I will say, I didn't think, thankfully we had a team. And so I wasn't always having to handle everything. And the experiences that I did have, I was like, man, if people just had like a healthy environment where having to fight for housing wasn't a thing. Like we could just actually say, this is where I was born, this is where I belong, and I'm in relationship with the land, and that's how I feed myself, I clothe myself, like all these things that are kind of like indigenous traditional ways, then people could actually solve a lot of their crises in the moment without having it to be delayed years, or having to rely on for it to get outsourced through the carceral system in order for them to feel like they get a minuscule amount of justice. And so I started to just be more cognizant of the way that we interact with the planet, and how our everything from our legal structures to our economic structures are just completely devastating our environment, that have led for us not to have good air quality, for us not to have good clean water, for us not to feel like we belong to the earth that is right beneath us, that we like are in relationship with the rest of most of our lives. And at the time I was living in West Oakland, and I had just looked into the air quality report in the area I lived in, and I had the worst air quality in the whole Bay Area. And I started noticing my dog started developing like little spots on her skin. I started having like a lot of chronic coughing. And I was looking at how much money I was making. And so at the time, I was doing a lot of art pop-ups. I was really passionate about zero waste. I cared about veganism. A lot of it was through the planet. And it just slowly started shifting away from, yes, I care about how we respond to violence and harm and all of that. And I want us to have alternatives that meet the needs of folks who fall through the waistline of certain systems. And at the same time, we don't even have clean water to come home to drink when something violent happens. Like we have to go buy it from, a grocery store. And most of us don't even test our tap water anymore, because it's just consistently, we just grew up thinking that it's dirty, it's gross, it's non-potable. So
right.
I think at that moment, my heart just completely was like, I want to dive into this work 100%. I want to fight for people to have clean air. Like if you can't breathe, then you can't even do a lot of things. And so many Black and brown people who grew up in rural communities have high rates of asthma, have low life expectancy because of air pollution, through the logistics industry, et cetera. And I just kind of fell in with all my heart in, like, if I'm against plastic, which at the time I was like vegan for the planet and vegan for my health. And I was also really passionate about reducing plastic use. And I was like, if these are two things that I care about, I want to do it at a larger scale. So it meant that I had to really make those connections of, if I want to end gender-based violence, if I want to end large forms of violence, I have to start with the one common thing we have that we're constantly extracting and violating, which is the earth. And I
Hmm.
think that led me towards climate justice, because that is the most critical environmental crisis that we're in at this moment.
So, what is the climate crisis? What causes this? How do you think about culture as a source of power and strategy for confronting the
Yeah,
climate crisis?
you know this, that this is what I do for my life. Is I've spent the last 7 to 8 years really strategizing around what are the cultural shifts that are needed in order for us to be able to be in right relationship with the planet, where things like the climate crisis are not happening, so that we can have an economic system and a political system that is serves the planet and the needs of us living and thriving, not surviving, which is, I think, what we're stuck in as a global society now. And the we have like quite a few things to kind of look at historically, and I think that there is a dominance of which is, we now know it as like white supremacy, which is the idea that one group of human is like better than another group of human, and that because of that everybody else needs to conform to the languages, the culture, the food, the clothes, the housing structures that are pervasive in that, in the Eurocentric um, way of living, and that has created a monoculture that is now spread at a global scale. And when you have one species dominating over another, it leads towards a crisis. So I think we're in an imbalance of relationships because of white supremacy, and that's what's causing the climate crisis.
Hmm.
We have a monoculture, and so just as you look at monocropping, as you look at anything like that, it eradicates the health of the soil because it doesn't have the reciprocal relationships that it needs from other crops and or the resting in order for the soil to be healthy. This might not be speaking to everybody who's listening, but I hope it makes sense. Is that
Yeah,
like
definitely.
the climate crisis is a symptom of a larger systemic problem,
Yeah.
and a lot of my work and my passion is really bringing as much power as I can to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, because the
Hmm.
retention of culture, language, and different ways of engaging with the world, everything from how we grow our food to how we dress and what we celebrate and what we honor, is what's going to help us be more resilient towards the impending and the realism of what the climate crisis means to a lot of our communities.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and you're living and working at this really interesting intersection between ecological justice, queer liberation, and indigenous culture. Can you talk a bit about the intersections of your identity and cultural background and their importance to you and how you orient yourself to this work?
Yeah, definitely. So, as I mentioned, I'm a descendant of the Yaqui and the Mayo tribes of the Sonoran Desert, and I didn't really realize how much this mattered to me. I think till about like 5 to 6 years ago, because I grew up because of the borders. Technically, I'm Mexican descent and Mexican American because I was born in this country. But the Mexican government is similar to what we're talking about. White supremacy was created by European settlers, and in a hybrid of mixture of stealing of indigenous cultures. And there are so many subgroups of different indigenous cultures, and my heritage is that both my grandfather and my grandmother's tribe is they were nomadic, and they used to migrate up and down the Sonoran Desert before the border was there, from seasonally for survival. And there's so many ways that, like, food that we eat, how we dress, how we talk, that I didn't realize, like, oh, that makes me so much more than just Mexican American, or makes me more than just Latinx. And I think my background and being in such close proximity to immigration and the necessity of immigration in order to survive, because my grandmother came to Tijuana because it was being industrialized and she needed work. And so when they migrated, they like left everything behind and they never went back. Like, I think so many people leave their home thinking that they're going to go back, and they don't. And their children are born in different places, and eventually that led me to be born in a different country. And so because of that background, I am so keen to issues around native sovereignty and land back here in the United States is like the retention of keeping people in the place of their origin is a climate solution. It's a way of keeping that ancestral knowledge in the place that is needed. I mean, here in Northern California, we look at the wildfire crisis, and it's due to climate change, and it's also due to the lack of forest management that our indigenous relatives that are native to that area have been robbed of the opportunity to maintain those forests at the
Right. With
scale at which is needed in order to adapt and prepare for wildfires. Yeah.
yeah, with the prescribed burning and all that maintenance that used to
Mm-hmm.
happen, that was
Mm-hmm.
invisible in so many ways to the European colonists. They didn't even understand that
Mm-hmm.
that was going on or how it worked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like it goes back to the monoculture, and I think because I have indigenous ancestry, because I understand the nature of needing to migrate and the realities of a migrant experience, I think I feel so passionate about keeping people in their place of origin as much as possible and allowing for people to move freely when they have to. And I think as the climate crisis gets worse, I start to realize just what a disservice we have made by instilling borders, by having governments that have been so gatekeepy and operating off of scarcity, that we've kind of mandated a world where people can't move freely, people have to leave their place of origin. And
Mm,
that these two paradoxes that we exist in is creating the dehumanization of a group of people, that if you cannot sustain yourself in your place of origin because of global extraction, by the way, because of environmental degradation and the economic viability of your area and how that creates wars and mass extraction, that is why people migrate. But yet those same people who are creating those systems that make it difficult for you to stay in your place of origin have also created borders to not let you move freely. That paradox to me is also part of this climate crisis, as because many of us are going to have to leave, John, at some point. There's going to be floods, there's going to be hot water, we're experiencing a drought crisis in California. I'm actually living between Northern California and Southern California already, and a lot of it is because of the wildfires, and my family's down here. And my family's at threat of sea level rise by living in San Diego, which San Diego filed a lawsuit against Exxon and Chevron, and I think one or two other oil companies. Is we're all existing now in this global climate crisis that it's not quite in our face every day, but we feel it seasonally now. So
mhm.
we're going to have to be able to move.
Right.
Yeah, and last to say is like similar to my culture is I live with an endocrine illness, and
Mm,
so air pollution is something that could severely impede my ability to reproduce, my ability to function. At this point, I spend about 4 to 5 days a month in bed, working from bed, and I'm fortunate enough that I get to work remotely. But for a lot of people, we're going to see more and more ways in which the mass extraction of the planet, which has led to the climate crisis, is how we become to adopt ways of having different abilities or not being able to live our day-to-day function. So
right.
yeah, the intersecting points are just they're overwhelming, and I think a lot of us are starting to feel that more as things start to kind of get a little worse.
Right. Right. Yeah, totally. Totally. Well, can you tell me about decolonizing conservation and the environmental movement and what that looks like to you?
Yeah, so I started during the beginning of the pandemic. I started a nonprofit called Shelterwood Collective, which is Black and Brown and Indigenous queer folks who are aiming to steward land. At the time, it was aiming to steward land. A month ago, we acquired a 900-acre camp in Casadero, California, in Northern California, and our team is about conservation efforts, specifically with forest resiliency against wildfires, um, uh, taking Western practices of conservation, mixing them with indigenous practices that are similarly to conservation. And I feel like when we think about conservation efforts, a lot of them have been dictated by European ways of thinking through conserving natural environments, which a lot of it is like humans are bad, nature must be left uncared for. And this does such a disservice because our indigenous ancestors knew that in order for a forest to be thriving, we needed to be in relationship with it. We needed to monitor it. If there was a fungi or a virus that was spreading, or a disease, that we could actually help it heal, help trees heal, help it spread less. If there was fires that were coming, that we could trim and tend and do controlled burns. If there was, anything happening where a species was struggling, that we could help support its growth and its population by, hunting its predators. And so I think that is the challenge between indigenous conservation efforts or traditional ways of just being in relationship with the natural environment and conservation is the Western conservation is that we have been so removed from what it means to protect water systems, what it means to protect forests, that now we have a crisis of mismanagement. And that more and more countries are adopting European Western perspectives because of the dominance that white supremacy has instilled, that there are a certain group of people that know more than we do. And that's created, at least for me, feels very heavy on when it comes to wildfires. There is certain areas in Northern California where there have been residential communities that have been built on wildfire lines that we know now indigenous people knew that like every 30 years, every 50 years, there would be a wildfire that would run through that area. And now that that it's getting hotter, the gap of that time is getting shortened. And also that we're realizing that the years, hundreds of years of mismanagement and lack of tending has led to also these extreme wildfires that's now causing casualties outside of wildlife. And I feel like conservation needs to evolve. I think that there needs to be more understanding around the harm that Western conservation has done to not only the ecosystems, but to the people who have traditionally been keeping those ecosystems. And I do feel like it's evolving. I just think that it's not evolving as fast as we need. And unfortunately, with the climate crisis, we're going to have to really come to reckoning. What do we need to move really fast on, and what can wait? Because it just feels like everything's urgent, and it just feels like we're going to have to pick and choose our battles here. And I do feel like coming to reckoning around the harm that this pervasiveness in Western conservation, which isn't the idea that sometimes we are harmful to our natural ecosystems, isn't a bad one. Yeah, we are, but how we got here was by completely removing ourselves and not knowing how to take care of those ecosystems. Right. Had we been in a relationship with them for the last 100 years, maybe we wouldn't be so wasteful. Maybe we would have caught air pollution sooner than our bodies telling us, hey, we don't like this. This is bad. We're going to die sooner if you keep doing this. And I think that is a disservice. So it's beautiful to see more forest schools popping up for young people. It's beautiful to see more conservation groups trying to bring in indigenous leaders into the conversations. But I do feel like that overall idea needs to shift. And I also think that the land back movement, which is returning national parks back to indigenous hands, is going to help alleviate some of those major tensions that do not honor that certain people have been doing this for hundreds of years. And if we don't return it in this generation, we just run the risk of losing more language, more culture, and more practices that we need at a larger scale.
Yeah, and protecting ecosystems is just not a complete picture of everything that's needed. Like, as you say, it's important on some level, but it's not a whole understanding of the problem or how to address it. So you work with the Center for Cultural Power, and one of the main projects you've done with them is Climate Woke, and I'd like to start by saying how much I love the artwork of the logo. It says Climate Woke, and it's in in the style of this fabulous flashback 1980s airbrushed T-shirt with rainbow colors and sparkles, and it feels like there's so much meaning embedded in the artwork. And I wondered if you could tell me about Climate Woke, how the project emerged, but also like how this logo artwork reflects what this project is.
Yeah, so when we started thinking about what Climate Woke would be, we didn't know it was going to be called Climate Woke. It was through several meetings with different community partners, different funders, and other stakeholders, where we kind of discussed that we wanted a unifying symbol for all the communities that we had been meeting. And we kind of landed that we wanted something to look good, to represent Black and Brown young people between the ages of 16 to 25, something that was appealing, that somebody would wear with pride. Um, and, at the time, there was a lot of different stuff coming up around the importance of wokeness. It wasn't used as how we use it now, which is like political correctness. It's not where it is now, and
Right.
so we decided to kind of ride on the term itself, climate woke, which uses Black vernacular very intentionally, that this is a racialized issue. Um, and we spoke with several leaders in the Black community, and at the time, it felt like it made sense. And so we kind of quickly were like, this makes sense, climate woke, because we want people to wake up to the climate crisis, but also be like down and enjoy it, and that it's different than this doom and gloom narrative that we constantly see when it comes to the environment. Because it is kind of depressing when you think about it. But and so we wanted it to feel like inviting. And at the time, which I think was like 2017, 2018, all these 90s was like coming back. So we sat with like 2 or 3 potential designers, and we didn't really like what we saw. And then it was Fabiana Rodriguez, who is kind of a co-creator of this, also like a globally recognized artist, who was like, hold on, I got this, and just like hopped on her computer, threw some colors, and we're like, we love it. Like, we just love it. We wanted it to be bright. We wanted it to be inviting. And I feel like we've been successful. Just 2 weeks ago, actually, I got a text from my executive producer who works on the Climate Woke content, and was like, to send a photo of I believe it was a young male of color, about 21 or 22 years old, wearing a Climate Woke t-shirt. And she was like, do you know where that's from? And he was like, no, I have no idea. And I was like, that's how you know we succeeded, because we popularized something and we made it look so good that people don't necessarily need to make the connections, but they'll still be promoting our work. And I'm sure, and I get so many compliments when I wear t-shirts and sweaters. And so she told them to look up the videos, and she sent me the photo, and she's like, I think we've succeeded. And I was like, I think we've succeeded. I think we have,
So in a couple of your videos, you talk about what being climate woke means to you. And you say it means, 1, standing up for communities of color and communities most impacted by climate change. 2, complicating the conversations on climate and the environment. And 3, doing something about it. Can you take me through each of these and break them down a bit?
We need Black, Brown, and Indigenous people to feel protected and seen when it comes to the climate and environmental crisis, and that's everything from activating people in positions of power to empowering the people who come from those communities to know that this is an intersectional issue. I think that the climate crisis traditionally was like a lot of visuals of melting ice caps, a lot of visuals of the polar bears, and it's interesting because as we're getting more people narrative, I feel like we need to get a little bit more people narrative, and we need to return those images a little bit back, because the IPCC report has just been highlighting the rapid rates in which we're losing ice. And I think that when I initially thought of this, at the time, there wasn't highlights of how Indigenous people were protecting the large scale biodiversity that we have on the planet. There wasn't stories of urban Black or Brown youth trying to make a difference around solutions towards climate change. And so I kind of made it my purpose that Climate Woke would represent those demographics that I was important for me, that Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color were at the center of these solutions. Complicate the conversations and do something about it was that I actually feel like we have a crisis of binary versus complexity in our society. And I think that how we've gotten to this climate crisis is because everything's been painted so black and white for us, that if you want a job, you have to be harming the planet. If you want to be unemployed, then like all these hippies that are fighting to save the trees, they're taking away your job. So I feel like there's so many ways in which our trauma responses just look for the patterns have been used against us. And it just felt really important for me that people feel comfortable to complicate as much as possible. We're gonna need different angles and different ways of looking at solutions. That we need to embrace experimentation, we need to embrace failures, and we need to really let go of these ideas that technology is going to come in and save us. Technology is a big reason why we got into this mess. And so I think that complicating the conversation to me was about this, is like, if you are Black, Brown, Indigenous, and you want to be a part of the climate crisis, but you have no way of integrating yourself besides talking about gender oppression, go for it. Look at the leaders in this movement, and look at how many women are fighting and protecting, at a larger global scale, that don't get the visibility that they deserve. And so I feel like that was my aim, is to really invite that complexity. And then the let's do something about it is that I don't want things to get stuck on the dialogue. One of the biggest failures of the United Nations when addressing these crises is that they don't have global jurisdiction, so they cannot actually mandate and or enforce a lot of these. It's usually done through economic influence. So like if we can get a first world to sign on to a certain agreement, then hopefully they'll all do it. But then who ends up implementing it? Usually it's not the United States, and Europe is not the first one to do it. And yet we are the biggest global polluters on almost every sector you can think of. And I think that the do something about it is, for me, a call to action, that we can talk about this. We can try to understand carbon emissions, methane emissions, global greenhouse, carbon markets, carbon sequestering, drawdown methods. We can talk about it. But if we're not doing it, putting it to practice while integrating these other 2 points, which is centering communities of color and embracing the complexity of that, then it's nothing. It's pointless. We're just allowing corporations to keep exploiting the planet, and governments can keep, sitting back and saying that they're doing something because they're convening people without actually regulating and putting down their foot for us. So, yeah, I think it was trying to summarize just my general feelings of this movement, and the ways that there's been just lack of opportunities by not centering certain other people or allowing there to be more complexity.
Well, I wanted to talk a bit about what environmental justice means to you, and I thought we could start with your video called "A Power to Rely On," and you include a statistic in the video that says, in the U.S., 75% of all houses without electricity are on Navajo land, and then one of the people you interview in the video, Walia Johns, with a group called Native Renewables, says, "Whoever controls your water and your power controls your destiny." And that's a really powerful statement. Can you talk a bit about your experience working on this video and how it impacted your thinking about environmental justice?
Yeah, so I realized that I'm really passionate about renewable energy and alternatives to energy capturing, probably through working on this video. And when we were first thinking about what themes we were going to cover, that's usually how I approach most of the climate woke videos. Is I try to talk to a few community partners, but mostly I just do a lot of like cultural observation, just like what are some of the themes that are kind of resonating for people outside of the sector. So what's resonating for folks outside of the environmental justice world. And, land back native sovereignty is something that's been popularized, especially after the Standing Rock camp, the No Dapple camp. And I was noticing that it was kind of dwindling down, but a lot of data was coming up around the fact that a lot of indigenous communities are either sitting around and or holding and protecting 80% of the global biodiversity. And um, so something that how I approached this video is I wanted to show the native sovereignty piece with the land back, as well as my passion for alternatives to our current energy use. And Wahala Johns is somebody who was recommended to me by Jade Begai, who's also featured in the video, who's a dear, close, like cultural strategist, filmmaker, co-conspire in the sector. And
Oh, wow.
when I was working on this video and I had talked to her and I interviewed her, she was giving me a lot of these numbers, and I just realized that the irony of this country is just beyond what we could imagine. You have a lot of these coal mines that help fuel some of the larger energy consuming cities in the United States, like Vegas, like LA, that just consume energy at such high rates, that are being powered by coal mines in Navajo or near Navajo Dene reservations. And yet I was hearing about Wahela's program, and her efforts were just trying to get funding and or subsidies from the government in order to put solar panels on folks' house, because the infrastructure doesn't exist. So I think I went into this video just knowing that I was going to try to make those connections. But what I realized was that I was actually going in to learn myself just how much I need to humble myself with the realities that communities who have had less to nothing in certain things, everything from food to energy to water, have made alternatives that they've already created the solutions. Like, we found one of the elders who had put up one of the first solar panels in a Hopi reservation, which I highlighted in my video. She got it 30 years ago. I was flabbergasted that she had the foresight, and the way that she articulated was everything from comfort to entertainment. But at the end of it was she knew she needed power, and she runs a business, a local business, one of very few on the reservation that she was passionate enough to keep alive. And so this video just showed me that, like, wherever you go where there has been disenfranchisement, that's where you will find solutions. Because a lot of people have just making do for a long time. It just hasn't been seen. It hasn't been highlighted. And those are the people that, like, the UN should be talking to. Our federal government should be listening to.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to talk to you about Janice Day, who's the Hopi elder that you mentioned. And, in particular, how it relates to how adept and skillful you are at communicating with people from a wide range of backgrounds. And you use humor a lot. And in this A Power to Rely On video, you're sitting down with Janice Day and talking about how she's one of the first people to get solar power 30 years ago. And you asked her whether the first thing she'd charge with solar power would be a vibrator. And that was really that was really funny. And all of a sudden I'm watching with anticipation, asking myself, how is this woman going to react to that question? And you seem to have such a good read on the people you're speaking with. And I was hoping you could talk a bit more about how you communicate so well in so many different spaces, and how you consciously or unconsciously lubricate the relationships with humor.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is my passion for humor has been maintained by a lot of data and information that I've gotten around just the importance of people being able to process things through laughter, and that the climate crisis is nothing to make mockery and or to laugh. It's very serious, the ways at which our species is kind of being at threat of extinction and right before our eyes. But I think that as humans, we're so complex and layered, and we're so beautiful in the sense that we get to feel so intensely, and feeling is what motivates us to take action. And laughter helps you process so much data quicker. It helps you be able to take something in, embrace it, release, and then have it make an impression. That is the one line that everybody brings up with that video. So I made the impression, and I hope that people watched it and then wanted to show it to other people. Um, and so I think that knowledge has retained my passion for humor. And then, like I said, I grew up in an abusive home where we had to process things fairly quickly in order to be able to function in the world, to go to school, to go to work. And growing up in a home where there was a lot of violence, I learned how to read people very keenly, everything from anticipating when something was going to happen to not. And I speak about that pretty like nonchalantly, because I think a lot of us have a lot of strategies and skills that we've developed because of our traumas and our negative experiences that we've had in the world. And I think they don't often get seen as that. We'll just say like, well, I'm just really good at reading people, and we'll leave it at that. And it's like, but where did you learn that from? Like, there had to have been many chronic situations where you had to be really good at reading people in order for you to like practice it so clearly and skillfully. And so I think I honor my experience in that in order for me to do that. And then I'm grateful that I can embody that and be able to offer it to people who are curious about climate change and then feel more invited through laughter than they would about doom and gloom or heavy statistic videos and or ways of gathering information.
Awesome. Well, another climate woke video you made is called Consumerism, Cancel Prime. And the first shot is you waiting while the camera crew sets up the shot, and you're putting items in your Amazon cart on your phone. And then the quote-unquote real video begins, and you say, 80% of California's cargo goes through the Inland Empire. And then you yell a long expletive that's beeped out, and you ask emphatically, is Climate Woke about to ruin Amazon Prime for me? And I love how rather than just saying Amazon or Amazon customers are bad, you're starting by implicating yourself in this system that leads to serious environmental justice issues. And again, it's really funny. Can you talk more about the situation with Amazon and other retailers and how you went about positioning yourself in this story and using humor again and self-criticism to connect to the audience?
Yeah. I mean, when we first started working on this video, we explored different avenues of that opening scene. We knew we wanted to highlight community members. I kind of at this point have a pretty good like tempo of what it is that I want. I want a community member. I want somebody who's like academic or scientifically based, and then somebody else who kind of comes and allows there to be more of a creative flow. So we have a pretty good structure at this point of the voices that we seek. We just didn't know how we wanted to hook the audience, and we went back and forth quite a bit on this. The thing that kept coming up was Amazon Prime memberships are very common. Most people have them. Most people buy on e-commerce, and this is pre-COVID. And I was keenly aware of that. I also knew that Amazon was growing as a franchise to now own Whole Foods. They were just like expanding in regards to what it is that they offer people online. And as I mentioned, through my passion for reduction of plastic usage and plastic consumption and plastic waste, I understand the ways that e-commerce has really hurt the planet. So I myself am not an Amazon Prime member. I don't actually buy online, and I allow myself, when needed, one Amazon thing, a purchase a year, and it's like kind of more of a values aligned thing. So in order for me to reach connecting with somebody who's kind of a little bit more normal in regards to needing to rely on buying online, is I just had to exaggerate what I think happens when you're shopping, which is you look at a lot of stuff, you add them to your cart, you get really excited, and you kind of mindlessly click buy without knowing what's going to happen, but you're excited when it arrives, surprisingly, because maybe you bought it in the middle of the night while drinking some wine and watching some Hulu. And then what I was really trying to highlight in this video was I wanted to invite audiences to not feel shame about what they do. Like we've all been indoctrinated by the the system through what our education has taught us. Like we have values of individualism and patriotism and all these things because that's what we were taught in schools, and that's been used and co-opted by corporations in order for us to continue exploiting other humans and the planet. And that's by no fault of our own. That's a design. That's an economic model that was designed since the Great Depression. It's just the way that it's been exaggerated and has scaled so quickly is beyond our control, where our governments don't even regulate it anymore at the ways in which they should be. And I think that I wanted this to feel like it's not just on you as an individual, but it's specifically if you live in Europe or in the United States, you need to know that we are the biggest consumers on the planet. We have the most economic resources. We actually, if even a fraction of the United States decided to stop shopping at Amazon, we could significantly bring that empire down. I say empire pretty intentionally. And we could. I mean, I feel like you and how I understand economics is that all you need to do is impact 10 to 20% of supply and demand chain in order for a whole corporation to collapse. The problem is that our governments always come in to aid these large corporations that are hurting us and the planet by saying that they want to maintain jobs and maintain a GDP or a going stock market, which they're reliant on. So this video was meant for audiences and for people to feel like this is not just on you, but if you live in a first world nation, you have power and I need you to use it. And at the same time, it's a bigger system. So it's not going to be enough for us to cancel our Amazon Prime memberships. It's also going to be on us to support community organizers, sign petitions, when possible, join council meetings, um, uh, call your senators and your mayors.
And can you talk about what the situation is with the trucks and the distribution centers and like what's the environmental justice issue there?
Yeah, I mean, so there's the manufacturing of goods, which the manufacture of goods is done through a large global scheme. Things are extracted in raw material from high mineral producing areas like Africa, South America, different places like that. Then the raw materials get moved to places where they can be manufactured quickly with the lowest cost, which is typically places that are not heavily regulated by the government, which is China, Asian countries, other places like that. But they are very prevalent in Asian countries. They get put on trucks, and then the trucks drive from LA or Long Beach to the Inland Empire, where communities there are fighting to maintain their residential communities because warehouses are being popped up so fast. And so you have a lot of people in positions of governmental power just constantly approving developers to build and build more warehouses. So you have schools, hospitals, and homes right next to and surrounded by warehouses that their sole purpose is to store materials, anticipating you to click buy. And the biggest culprits in that area are Walmart, Target, and Amazon. And so when you look at the what is happening is the problem is the storage and the breakdown of the residential communities, because now you have people who can't afford to live and or work there that need to sell their homes, and they're being bought up at rapid rates by warehouses, and then the warehouses all of a sudden appear within months of time, and we're talking about football fields worth of warehouses. I think we had said that in the video. And the problem that's impacting the health of those communities is that these trucks, they're coming in. I mean, y'all, we buy really a lot in this country, so we need to be supplying and keeping these warehouses fully stocked in order for them to be efficient, so that you can get it the next day if that's what you choose, which a lot of people do tend to go that route, specifically when Amazon gives it out so freely. And so in order to do that, we have to have trucks constantly coming and going from the ports in LA and in Long Beach down to the Inland Empire. And then you have a lot of homes that are still built, that are still living alongside these freeways, because the Inland Empire is a big cross of many different interstates and highways. and the trucks are stuck in traffic. And so you have communities there that are lowering their life expectancy from like up to 10 to 15 years. We're seeing a lowering in life expectancy because of respiratory complications like asthma, cancer, other illnesses, and there isn't enough solutions to this problem. It's very common there that people have respiratory conditions. So yeah, that's the scheme of it. It's a lot of it is the logistics of how to get your goods to you that is hurting people's health. And then if you look at the larger scale of assembling and creating those goods is what's causing global greenhouse emissions. That's causing climate change. So it's really addressing it on the place where we feel the most empowered to, which is stop demand.
So recently you launched a podcast called, recently I think you wrapped up the first season of the podcast. And it's called Did We Go Too Far? And you co-host it with Trey Vasquez. And I love the podcast. It's enormous amount of fun. And your movement from video into podcasting also, of course, reminds me of my own kind of trajectory of looking for new ways to expand and deepen important conversations beyond film and video. And you cover so much ground in the podcast with shows on everything from pandemic parenting to liberated communities to my personal favorite, a beautiful show on fashion and queer ecology. Can you tell me how you got into podcasting and how it's related to the other work you do, like the videos?
Yeah, I think that I've always been really passionate about just telling a story. And Movement Generation, who is the executive producer of the podcast, we had been thinking about how I could support them in creating some content in order to get their just transition framework out. And so I was coming in already with a lot to compete with. Is they had executive produced a web series called The North Pole Show, led by Josh Healy. And they, it eventually made it to second season. And by then, Rosario Dawson had also been co-executive producer. So I was kind of coming in being like, oh man, I don't know if I can create something as amazing as that. And at the same time, I was really excited about the challenge. And so we had a few ideation meetings where we talked about what was important for them to tell, which were pretty politically aligned and we care about the same social issues. We identified a few people who wanted to be involved, Trey Vasquez being one of them, and then Ellen Choi, who's also a collective member. And we had several meetings where we just thought through, like, what are some of the things we want to talk about? And so I was really hoping that the podcast could be the mixture of accessibility that they bring, as well as the humor that I like to bring. But we started by creating kind of a list of topics. We did some hybrids. So the queer ecologies and fashion was a hybrid one. And we started identifying people we wanted to highlight in the community that were doing amazing work. And then we just started pairing up the themes, and everybody was approving and giving their opinions throughout all of it. And it was really rewarding. One of the things that I've been able to do to translate from film over to or from video over to podcasts is this collaborative nature that is possible with creating content that isn't actually very easy to do, especially when you have a vision. But that I always find it as a fun, challenging thing is how do I get other stakeholders, other people who care about me, who care about creating, who don't have necessarily all the skills, but they have a story to be told. How do I make it easy? And so for them, podcasting was the easy way to go about it. And I was excited. So it was overall very rewarding. And how I made the switch was that it just made sense. We were in a pandemic. People were very tuned in to having more of a connection. And it was really timely. When we started planning for this was about 6 months prior to the pandemic. And then we contemplated just making it about current events and releasing it sooner than later. But we ultimately agreed that the issues and the themes we were trying to hit were merited giving such good attention. So if you haven't listened to it, I recommend you do. It's called Did We Go Too Far? And I think it's just a good way to get some information and to also get a little chuckles and giggles over, about some things that are kind of difficult to digest at times.
Yeah, totally. And just transition is a key issue you address in the podcast. Can you talk about what just transition is and how you think that term has been used or misused or appropriated in environmental spaces?
I think that just transitions are often used as like we just need to move away from fossil fuels. We need to invest in green economies, and when it stops at that scale and it doesn't look at the way that the current labor sector is set up, like for example, where there is like a CEO or a president or somebody who like runs a whole company, and then you have all the laborers underneath them, that it's more likely for there to be a margin of failure, margin of harm on the planet, because it's the actual people who work the land, who extract the raw materials, who run the companies, who can be able to inform and or realign to sustainable practices. So I think the just transition framework has evolved now, where you have a lot more organizers and activists talking about now just recovery as well. It's like when there's a hurricane, can we potentially get support not only on the food aid or initial Red Cross aid, but also like how do we look at the current infrastructure and how when the next hurricane hits, it's going to put us in the same position versus how do we adapt so that the negative impacts it has on communities are actually minimal. I think just transition is about doing something that's a little bit more holistic, that centers a new world, which is about being in reciprocity and regeneration with the planet and our ecosystems, and that our economic models mimic that. And I think that we can do it. I think that that's why I'm a big champion for it, and I love to talk about that.
So, another thing I hear you say a lot on the podcast is "I don't know," which I read as a powerful political statement in a world where all kinds of people claim to know. What's the importance to you of humility and being honest about not having the answers? And how do you see that approach to the world in contrast to other approaches you might encounter out there?
So in the first episode, we covered that idea that like, yeah, that's a larger mainstream ideology of like needing to have solutions to either problems or needing to have answers to questions that may feel daunting. And in the first episode, we kind of sat with that of how that has seeped into our social movements, our social justice movements, that even when we are fighting a big crisis, we are still carrying the same values that have dominated our American society, for lack of like, just thinking about it at a bit of a national scale, which are like individualism and greed that have really pushed us to feel like we have to create solutions. And when we're looking at something as big as the climate crisis, it's actually in the practice of slowing down that not only are we going to find solutions, but we're going to be actually practicing the solution, which a lot of why we're exasperated. There's the tension and the pressure that we're putting on the planet that's causing this large symptom and reaction, is because we're moving at such a fast pace that in the slowing down and trying to find more holistic and diverse solutions is where we'll be able to thrive. And so I think that there's a bit of an ego problem in this country, and I think in first world countries, where everybody wants to be right, everybody wants to lead in the technology that's going to quote unquote save us, and everybody wants to have all the solutions that are going to be spread at a global scale. And that is a symptom of value and a belief that we've all inherited from white supremacy.
Yeah, it's so woven into everything. So another video you made recently is called "A Grief Letter to COVID," which combines a poem of yours read by several people with images from Oakland, San Francisco, and LA, I think, and many beautiful moving portraits of people in the community wearing masks. Could you read this poem and tell me a bit about the story behind it, and particularly how the COVID pandemic has informed your work and your understanding of what we face with other cascading crises?
So I wrote this, and I'll speak a little bit more about why, but it's called A Grief Letter to COVID. COVID, you ravaging monster. If you could, please listen. I don't know why the universe brought you to us, and somehow in a sick way, I feel like we needed you. Do I need to thank you? You've been taking on a bigger beast. You keep showing us who's really to blame, that even in a crisis, we are last to be protected, last to be seen, last to be vaccinated. Hit first, hit hard. We're hit, hit, hit. COVID, you are our wake up call. You are reminding us that no matter what, we need to save us, care for us. We've got us. COVID, you literal virus. You spread and no sea, land, or distance is a barrier for you. Stop taking our family. Stop taking my loved ones. Deja a mi familia en paz. Why do you let them die alone? COVID, we're done. This is a grief letter, a breakup letter. We're breaking up with you. We're breaking up with the systems keeping us down. This abusive relationship needs to stop. We will draw tarot cards, cast protection spells, and pray. Oh God, how we have prayed. But we're done. Take this as a warning to the greedy, a warning to the supremacists, a warning to the systems that be. We are done being seen last. We are done being ignored. We demand vaccinations now. We demand healthcare now. We demand pay to stay home. COVID, slow us all down to that so that our loved ones can recover, so that we can curb the spread, so that we can fight for more vaccines. This is our last call. COVID, go away to where you come from. And while you're at it, take the greed, take the racism, take the injustices to us, our kinship, and our planet. Take everything that isn't working. Sincerely, the people who are sick of this shit. So I started to write this at, it was kind of like an artist residency. At the time, my aunt and my uncle in Mexico were fighting to survive COVID, which they did, thankfully. And then I had an uncle who was in the ICU, and I think I had just found out that he passed away. My uncle who passed away was African American, and it just the statistics were coming up around how prevalent COVID was in the Black community. And then shortly after, while I was writing this, I wrote the first draft. I wrote it around that time, and then when I was doing edits, my cousin got COVID. I had another cousin who got COVID, and then my grandmother's sister passed away from COVID, from respiratory complications. And I was just really enraged. I was just pissed off that this was happening to my community, and that I wasn't surprised because my family is, first generation migrant, people of color, and my family, they're all frontline workers, working restaurants, working janitorial services. And my sister was a frontline worker. She's a nurse. And every other week it was like, oh, I could potentially have COVID. So she was quarantining like at least once a month from coming home from work. And she has 2 kids. And I was going back and forth between being in San Diego to help with childcare to being up to Northern California. And I was sitting in my 300 square foot apartment when I was there, and just like feeling so relieved that I felt so safe, and at the same time when I would leave, just feeling so scared of potentially getting in. This is pre-vaccination, and the rollout was happening of the vaccination, and then there was more anti-vaxxing rhetoric that was spreading in migrant communities, and eventually in a lot of Black communities. And so when we were starting to produce this and turn it into a video was when the vaccine rollout was like just at eyesight. And this felt important for me to write because I was upset, I was pissed off. But what I loved about the time in quarantine was that I got to isolate, and I got to really sit and care about the things that I wanted. I grew my garden beds from 2 beds to 6 beds. I was harvesting a lot from the land that I lived on at the time. And I was spending more time at home. I started hiking. I actually hiked. I think I ended up hiking at most like 14 miles at one go, about like 2,000 elevation and increase. I was featured on a podcast because I picked up hiking, and I was feeling really healthy. I was cooking at home 3 times a day, and all this is happening while my relatives are sick. And I'm sure that they had some positives as well of like not of needing to stay home, and also the negatives of the economic disparity. I was fortunate enough that I could work remotely. And so I wrote this because it was like being in COVID at the height of it really highlighted that all these systemic disadvantages were all made up. A lot of us were being asked to stay home. The government was doing some rollouts around, some of the ways that they were financially compensating people to stay home, which was not enough and not anything close to what people were losing. And then at the same time, we were seeing women of color being let go of jobs and losing jobs at the highest rate. So it was a culmination of me processing that information. And then the piece that I wrote around like, take everything with you that isn't working, like greed and racism was my attempt at being like, when COVID goes away, I want this world to be reset. And this, like, to protect our kinship and our planet and allow for these injustices to go away was in me highlighting that COVID wasn't ecological crisis. Like, we have extracted from the planet at such high rates. It's so much that we're going so much more deeper into wildlife that has not had contact with humans, that we're coming into contact with other viruses. And if we do not slow down our extraction rates, we're going to have more and more pandemics like these happening. And as the variants continue, it's going to just keep mutating and potentially have larger effects that we're unaware of. And so this was a way of me processing that, and that at the systemic scale, I just wanted to let people know that we needed to stop extracting from the earth in the way that it was, and that as people, we were done. We're fed up with the ways that we've been systemically disproportioned and used to harm the planet. And so the people who are sick of this shit is like a call of solidarity for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, for us to just have a voice. But it was a very powerful piece, and I'm grateful that the Center for Cultural Power allowed me to turn it into a poetry video.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. Listening to you talk about it reminds me, about a decade or so ago, I got cancer, and it was really bad cancer. I almost died. But, when I first got it and I kind of like entered this kind of cancer culture in a way and started reading a bunch of stuff, I kept seeing this expression that people would say is, cancer is the best thing that ever happened to me. And when I first, at the beginning of this whole experience, I just remember thinking, like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And by the end of the cancer experience, and I did survive, which is a key part of it, but I understood it all of a sudden, where it's not something you would ever wish on anyone, but it does so much work to reveal the fissures and the fractures and the assumptions that you're making in life, and the things that were always there that you didn't necessarily see. And I don't know, your poem makes me think a lot about that in relation to COVID, and how with all the terrible things that COVID is, it's also an opportunity to see the world differently, possibly in ways you haven't seen it before, but possibly just to refocus on what you already knew and seeing, like, even more how important it is.
Yeah, that's a powerful connection, John.
But yeah, well, I love your poem, and the piece you made is really beautiful. So thank you for reading that again here.
Of course, my pleasure.
So going back to young Layel growing up in San Diego, how has your thinking changed since then about who you are, about your relationship to the rest of life on the planet?
I mean, I would say it's changed pretty drastically. I think that young me was just really absorbed in the world that I lived in, which I think happens to a lot of us. And the fact that, like, I had dreams of having a family and having a connection with, the people that I loved and cared, and a career that, like, fueled my heart. And now that I'm older, I'm realizing that, like, what I at my core wanted was, as a young person, was I wanted purpose, value, and meaning in life. And that I found I could summarize that in that way through these accomplishments that I saw for myself as a child based off of what I thought you had to do. And now that I'm older, and I think specifically coming out as queer and definitely jumping into more understanding like my role in the larger ecological crisis, is that the possibilities of what finding meaning, purpose, and value is actually way more bigger and complex than I can imagine. So I still want all those things. I want connection with the people that I love. I still want to, have a quote unquote viable career, which I think really just is my purpose. And my purpose is to tell stories and help create a world where we're in better relationship with the planet. And I feel like I'm doing all those things. And I don't necessarily feel like at my heart I have changed too much. I actually have this strong line that I kind of go by on a day to day, which is like, people don't change. People are at the core who they are and how they were born into the planet, needing to be. And at the same time, how I interpret that and how I choose to practice it, that's the part that has shifted. And a lot of it is through learning about the ways that ancestry, what's been eradicated from my history, from my personal indigenous lineage, and then what's been eradicated from other people's lineages, and seeing how I can learn and adapt and be a better person, and also looking at where we're headed. I'm contemplating starting a family very soon, and I think a lot about why I want that, and then also what are some of the things I need to teach not only my children but the children that I have close relationship with, and what I want to leave behind if and or when I leave this earth. And so I feel like a lot of that is rooted on us repairing and making this earth viable for not only myself but the next 7 generations, as a lot of indigenous elders like to remind us of. And I think that has changed. I think initially it was like, have kids, have a good home, and have a career. And now I think it's like, oh, I actually have a large impact, and I'm choosing to like step into that and help create a better place for not myself, but the next generations. And I take that pretty seriously, but also with comedy.
As you always do, which is fabulous. So I've asked you to bring a quotation to read that's been particularly meaningful in your journey in life. Could you end the show by reading what you brought and telling the story of its significance to you?
Yeah. So I'm going to pull it up on my email so I don't misread it, because I've read it so many times that sometimes I feel like I make up my own interpretation of it. But the quote is, "You want to fly, you got to give up the shit that weighs you down." And that's by Toni Morrison, in the book Song of Solomon. And the first time I heard this, I was in high school. And I think I was like 15 or 16 at the time. And I was in this terrible rut where I was just like ditching school every day and just feeling so dissatisfied. I think that's the year I got a concussion. And as I had mentioned, I was a competitive swimmer. So I wasn't even swimming. And then, I guess I would now understand that as like I was depressed. And I was sitting in my AP, but I was still an overachiever, y'all. Like how I managed, I have no idea. But I was sitting in my AP English, like literature class, and we had to read this book. I hate reading, but my teacher did such a great job at like taking us through the synopsis and the summary of the actual storyline, which is very metaphorical. The book is very, very deep, and I was in such a deep, depressive place that I really connected with it. And I remember when we got to this line, which is one of the characters that were very like, there's a lot of metaphors around this character talking about wanting to fly, a lot of it was like connected to suicide and depression. And I realized that this line, "You want to fly, you got to give up the shit that weighs you down," just spoke to my spirit, and I have come across so many other passages that are very equally equally inspirational, but I always come back to this one because there's always a situation where I have to give up something in order for me to get to something else. For example, in order for me to get to college, I had to give up what I knew, and I jump into this place that I had no idea. Most recently, I've been, as I mentioned, I've been going back and forth between Northern and Southern California, and I had to give up my home in Northern California in order for me to be able to have more mobility. I'm in a relationship with somebody who's autoimmune compromised, and she works and lives in Los Angeles. And so, because of the pandemic, I had to start making some of those choices. And so I feel like every single situation that I have found myself where it's difficult, even in advocating for the planet and everything, there's always something that is holding us down, that once we get the consciousness that we need to make a leap to something better, that we have to let go of. And to me, this speaks to my whole purpose in serving the planet, and everything that I've talked about now. It's like, to jump into video production, I had to jump into something I didn't know and give up the comfort of, sitting behind my work. In order to jump into climate change, I had to shift how I was advocating for better lives for people and leave behind my more active participation in transformative justice. And so I feel like everything isn't shit. Sometimes you have to give it up, but it turns into shit if you hold on to something that isn't serving you anymore. So I feel Toni Morrison and this quote has always guided me, and I want to read more of her books. And sometimes I'll pick up, different books of hers. I actually have a lot of them on my bookshelf that I haven't read, but a lot of it is reading visually doesn't work for me. Audiobook is the best. And so I feel like I always want to get into things, but for some reason, this quote is one of the things that whenever I've come across it again, I just want to reread it over and over. And it just shows to me that as a low income youth who grew up in a disadvantaged community, that I didn't have to read a whole book. I just needed to have a connection with a passage in order for me to make great leaps that I don't think would have been possible had I not had this perspective from a woman who really gave herself the opportunity to sit through and be intentional around how she walked around the earth and had big impact. And if that's the impact she had on me, I can't imagine what she did for other Black Americans who just needed to see themselves more represented in storytelling.
Yeah, she's absolutely incredible. Well, that's a great place to end. Thank you so much for joining me today, Layel. It's been an amazing conversation, as always, with you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you so much to Layel Camargo. Go to our website at chrysalispodcast.org, where you can find the quotation Layel read from Toni Morrison, plus book and media recommendations, and links to Layel's video works and organizations they've worked with. Chrysalis is produced and edited by Gabriela Corba Vivas, with music by Daniel Rodriguez Vivas, designed by Unaira Guerrero, and mixing by Morgan Honecker. If you enjoyed my conversation with Layel, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Contact me anytime at chrysalispodcast.org, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter and support us with a donation.